Hi, boys and girls. This is Mrs. P, and I am back with a series of unfortunate events. And this is Book 2, Book the Second, by Lemony Snicket, The Reptile Room. And we are, I read all of Chapter 2 last week and into Chapter 3. So we stopped right here where I said stopped here, and I'm going to erase that in a minute. Well, probably like in 15 minutes. So we'll start here. So let's see, what was the other sentence? Let's see. Okay, so they're learning about snakes. They're with their Uncle Monty. And let's go right from there. Uncle Monty taught them how to handle the inky newt without getting its black dye all over their fingers, and how to tell when the irascible python was getting grumpy and best left alone. He taught them not to give the green gimlet toad too much water, and to never, under any circumstances, let the Virginian wolf snake near a typewriter. I hope they tell us about that, because I'm not sure what that means. While he was telling them about the different reptiles, Uncle Monty would often segue, a word which here means let the conversation veer off, to stories from his travels describing the men, snakes, women, toads, children, and lizards he had met on his journeys. And before too long, the Beaudelaire orphans were telling Uncle Monty all about their lives, eventually talking about their parents and how much they missed them. Uncle Monty was as interested in the Beaudelaire stories as they were in his, and sometimes they got to talking so long that they scarcely had time to gobble down dinner before cramming themselves into Uncle Monty's tiny Jeep and heading to the movies. One morning, however, when the three children finished their breakfast and went into the reptile room, they found not Uncle Monty, but a note from him. And the note read as follows. Dear Bambini, I have gone into town to buy a few things that we need for the expedition. Peruvian wasp repellent, toothbrushes, canned peaches, and a fireproof canoe. It will take a while to find the peaches, so don't expect me back until after dinner time. Or until dinner time, not after dinner time. Stefano Gustav's replacement will arrive today by taxi. Please make him feel welcome. As you know, it is only 2 days until the expedition, so please work very hard today. Your giddy uncle, Monty. What does giddy mean? Violet asked when they had finished reading the note. Dizzy and excited, Klaus said, having learned the word from a collection of poetry he'd read in the first grade. I guess he means excited about Peru, or maybe he's excited about having a new assistant. Or maybe he's excited about us, Violet said. Kinda, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant, or maybe he's excited about all these things. I'm a little giddy myself, Klaus said. It's really fun to live with Uncle Monty. It certainly is, Violet agreed. After the fire, I thought I would never be happy again, but our time here has been wonderful. I still miss our parents, though, Klaus said. No matter how nice Uncle Monty is, I wish we still lived in our real home. Of course, Violet said quickly. She paused and slowly said out loud something she had been thinking for the past few days. I think we'll always miss our parents, but I think we can miss them without being miserable all the time. After all, they wouldn't want us to be miserable. Oh, remember that time, Klaus said wistfully, when we were bored one rainy afternoon and all of us painted our toenails bright red? Yes, Violet said, grinning, and I spilled some on the yellow chair. Arto, Sonny said quietly, which probably meant something like, and the stain never really came out. The Beaudelaire orphans smiled at each other and without a word began to do the day's work. For the rest of the morning they worked quietly and steadily, realizing that their continent here at Uncle Monty's house did not erase their parents' death, not at all, but at least made them feel better after feeling so sad for so long. It is unfortunate, of course, that this quiet, happy moment was the last one the children would have for quite some time. But there is nothing anyone can do about it now. Just when the Baudelaires were beginning to think about lunch, they heard a car pull up in front of the house and toot its horn. To the children, it signaled the arrival of Stefano. To us, it should signal the beginning of more misery. I expect that's the new assistant, Klaus said, looking up from the big Peruvian book of small Peruvian snakes. I hope he's as nice as Monty. Me too, Violet said, opening and shutting a toad trap to make sure it worked smoothly. It would be unpleasant to travel to Peru with somebody who was boring or mean. Gurja! Sunny shrieked, which probably meant something like, well, let's go find out what Stefano is like. The Baudelaires left the reptile room and walked out the front door to find a taxi parked next to the snake-shaped hedges. A very tall, thin man with a long beard and no eyebrows over his eyes was getting out of the back seat carrying a black suitcase with a shiny silver padlock. I'm not going to give you a tip, the bearded man was saying to the driver of the taxi, because you talk too much. Not everybody wants to hear about your new baby, you know. Oh, hello there. I'm Stefano, Dr. Montgomery's new assistant. How do you do? How do you do? Violet said as she approached him. There was something about his wheezy voice that seemed vaguely familiar. Oh, no. It doesn't say that there. I was just thinking ahead. Me, Mrs. P. How do you do? Klaus said, and as he looked up at Stefano, there was something about his shiny eyes that seemed quite familiar. Hoodah! Sunny shrieked. Stefano wasn't wearing any socks, and Sunny, crawling on the ground, could see his bare ankle between his pant cuff and his shoe. And there on his ankle was something that was most familiar of all. The Beaudelaire orphans all realized the same thing at the same time and took a step back as you might from a growling dog. This man wasn't Stefano, no matter what he called himself. The three children looked at Uncle Monty's new assistant from head to toe and saw that he was none other than Count Olaf. He may have shaved off his one long eyebrow and grown a beard over his scraggly chin, but there was no way he could hide the tattoo of an eye on his ankle. Okay, we're going to see if we can get through chapter 4. Oh, look at him. One of the most difficult things to think about in life is one's regrets. Something will happen to you. Something will happen to you, and you will do the wrong thing, and for years afterward, you will wish you had done something different. For instance, sometimes when I am walking along the seashore or visiting the grave of a friend, I will remember a day a long time ago when I didn't belong. What? Oh. When I didn't bring a flashlight with me to a place where I should have brought a flashlight, and the results were disastrous. Why didn't I bring a flashlight? I think to myself, even though it's too late to do anything about it, I should have brought a flashlight. For years after this moment in the lives of the Beaudelaire orphans, Klaus thought of the time when he and his siblings realized that Stefano was actually Count Olaf and was filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxicab who was beginning to drive back down the driveway. Stop, Klaus would think to himself, even though it was too late to do anything about it. Stop! Take this man away! Of course, it is perfectly understandable that Klaus and his sisters were too surprised to act so quickly, but Klaus would lie awake in bed years later thinking that maybe, just maybe, if he had acted in time, he could have saved Uncle Monty's life. But he didn't. As the Beaudelaire orphans stared at Count Olaf, the taxi drove back down the driveway, and the children were alone with their nemesis, a word which here means the worst enemy you could imagine. Olaf smiled at them the way Uncle Monty's Mongolian mean snake would smile when a white mouse was placed in its cage each day for dinner. Perhaps one of you might carry my suitcase into my room, he suggested in his wheezy voice. The ride along that smelly road was dull and unpleasant, and I am very tired. If anyone ever deserved to travel along Lousy Lane, Violet said, glaring at him, it is you, Count Olaf. We will certainly not help you with your luggage because we will not let you in this house. Olaf frowned at the orphans and then looked this way and that as if he expected to see someone hiding behind the snake-shaped hedges. Who is Count Olaf? He asked quizzically. My name is Stefano, and I am here to assist Montgomery with his upcoming expedition to Peru. I assume you three are the midgets who work as servants in the Montgomery home. We are not midgets, Klaus said sternly. We are children, and you are not Stefano. You are Count Olaf, and you may have grown a beard and shaved your eyebrow, but you're still the same despicable person, and we will not let you in this house. Fuda, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like I agree. Count Olaf looked at each of the Beaudelaire orphans, his eyes shining brightly as if he were telling a joke. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but if I did, and I were this Count Olaf you speak of, I would think that you were being very rude. And if I thought you were rude, I might get angry, and if I got angry, who knows what I would do. The children watched as Count Olaf raised his scrawny arms in a sort of shrug. It probably isn't necessary to remind you just how violent he could be, but it certainly wasn't necessary at all to remind the Baudelaires. Klaus could still feel the bruise on his face from the time Count Olaf had struck him when they were living in his house. Sonny still ached from being stuffed in a bird cage and dangled over the tower where he made his evil plans. And while Violet had not been the victim of any physical violence from this terrible man, she had almost been forced to marry him, and that was enough to make her pick up his suitcase and drag it slowly toward the door to the house. Higher, Olaf said. Lift it higher. I don't want it dragged along the ground like that. Klaus and Sonny hurried to help Violet with the suitcase, but even with the three of them carrying it, the weight made them stagger. It was misery enough that Count Olaf had reappeared in their lives just when they were feeling so comfortable and safe with Uncle Monty, but to actually be helping this awful person enter their home was almost more than they could bear. Olaf followed closely behind them, and then the three children could smell his stale breath as they brought the suitcase indoors and set it on the carpet beneath the painting of the entwined snakes. Thank you, orphans, Olaf said, shutting the front door behind him. Now, Dr. Montgomery said my room would be waiting upstairs. I suppose I can carry my luggage from here. Now run along. We'll have lots of time to get to know one another later. We already know you, Count Olaf, Violet said. You obviously haven't changed a bit. Well, you haven't changed either, Olaf said. It's clear to me, Violet, that you are as stubborn as ever, and Klaus, you are still wearing those idiotic glasses from reading too many books. And I see that little Sonny here still has 9 toes instead of 10. Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, I do not. What are you talking about? Klaus said. Klaus said impatiently. She has 10 toes just like everybody else. Really? Olaf said. That's odd. I remember that she lost one of her toes in an accident. His eyes shone even brighter as if he were telling a joke, and he reached into the pocket of his shabby coat and brought out a long knife such as one might use for slicing bread. I seem to recall there was a man who was so confused by being called repeatedly by the wrong name that he accidentally dropped a knife on her little foot and severed one of her toes. Violet and Klaus looked at Count Olaf and then at the bare foot of their little sister. You wouldn't dare, Klaus said. Let's not discuss what I would or would not dare to do, Olaf said. Let's discuss, rather, what I am to be called for as long as we are together in this house. We'll call you Stefano if you insist on threatening us, Violet said, but we won't be together in this house for long. Stefano opened his mouth to say something, but Violet was not interested in continuing the conversation. She turned on her heel and marched primly through the enormous door of the reptile room, followed by her siblings. If you or I had been there, we would have thought that the Beaudelaire orphans weren't scared at all, speaking so bravely like that to Stefano, and then simply walking away. But once the children reached the far end of the room, their true emotions showed clearly on their faces. The Baudelaires were terrified. Violet put her hands over her face and leaned against one of the reptile cages. Klaus sank into a chair, trembling so hard that his feet rattled against the marble floor. And Sunny curled up into a little ball on the floor, so tiny you might have missed her if you walked into the room. For several moments, none of the children spoke, just listened to the muffled sounds of Stefano walking up the stairs and their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. "How did he find us?" Klaus asked. His voice was a hoarse whisper, as if he had a sore throat. "How did he get to be Uncle Monty's assistant? What is he doing here?" "He vowed that he'd get his hands on the Beaudelaire fortune," Violet said, taking her hands away from her face and picking up Sunny, who was shivering. "That was the last thing he said to me before he escaped. He said he'd get our fortune if it was the last thing he ever did." Violet shuddered and did not add that he'd also said that once he got their fortune, he'd do away with all three of the Baudelaire siblings. She did not need to add it. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all knew that if he figured out a way to seize their fortune, he would slit the throats of the Beaudelaire orphans as easily as you or I might eat a small butter cookie. "What can we do?" Klaus asked. "Uncle Monty won't be back for hours." "Well, maybe we can call Mr. Poe," Violet said. "It's the middle of business hours. But maybe he could leave the bank for an emergency." "He wouldn't believe us," Klaus said. "Remember when we tried to tell him about Count Olaf when we lived there? He took such a long time to realize the truth it was almost too late. I think we should run away. If we leave right now, we could probably get to town in time to catch a train far away from here." Violet pictured the three of them all alone walking along Lousy Lane beneath the sour apples with the bitter smell of horseradish encircling them. "Where would we go?" she asked. Anywhere but here. We could go far away where Count Olaf wouldn't find us and change our names so no one would know who we were." "We haven't any money," Violet pointed out. "How could we live by ourselves?" "We could get jobs," Klaus replied. "I could work in the library maybe, and you could work in some sort of mechanical factory. Sunny probably couldn't get a job at her age, but in a few years she could." The orphans were quiet. They tried to picture leaving Uncle Monty and living by themselves, trying to find jobs and take care of each other, but it was a fairly lonely prospect. The Baudelaire children sat in sad silence a while, and they were each thinking the same thing. They wished that their parents had never been killed in the fire and that their lives had never been turned topsy-turvy the way they had. If only the Baudelaire parents were still alive, the youngsters wouldn't even have heard of Count Olaf, let alone have him settling into their home and undoubtedly making evil plans. "We can't leave," Violet said finally. "Count Olaf found us once, and I'm sure he'd find us again, and no matter how far we went. Plus, who knows where Count Olaf's assistants are? Or who? Yeah, who knows where they are? Perhaps they've surrounded the house right now, keeping watch in case we're on to him." Klaus shivered. He hadn't been thinking of Olaf's assistants. Besides scheming to get his hands on the Baudelaire fortune, Olaf was the leader of a terrible theater troupe, and his fellow actors were always ready to help him with his plans. They were a gruesome crew, each more terrifying than the next. There was a bald man with a long nose who always wore a black robe, and there were two men who always had ghostly white powder on their faces. There was a person so large and blank-looking that you couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, and there was a skinny man with two hooks where his hands should have been. Violet was right. Any of these people could be lurking outside Uncle Monty's house, waiting to catch them if they tried to escape. I think we should just wait for Uncle Monty to come back and tell him what's happened, Violet said. He'll believe us. If we tell him about the tattoo, he'll at least ask Stefano for an explanation. Violet's tone of voice when she said Stefano indicated her utter scorn for Olaf's disguise. Are you sure? Klaus said. After all, Uncle Monty is the one who hired Stefano. Klaus's tone of voice when he said Stefano indicated that he shared his sister's feelings. For all we know, Uncle Monty and Stefano have planned something together. Mindia! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, "Don't be ridiculous, Klaus." Violet shook her head. Sonny's right. I can't believe that Uncle Monty would be in cahoots with Olaf. He has been so kind and generous to us, and besides, if they were working together, Olaf wouldn't insist on using a different name. That's true, Klaus said thoughtfully. So we wait for Uncle Monty. We wait, Violet agreed. Toujours, Sonny said solemnly, and the siblings looked at one another glumly. Waiting is one of life's hardships. It is hard enough to wait for chocolate cream pie while burnt roast beef is still on your plate. It is plenty difficult to wait for Halloween when the tedious month of September is still ahead of you, but to wait for one's adopted uncle to come home while a greedy and violent man is upstairs was one of the worst waits the Beaudelaires had ever experienced. To get their mind off it, they tried to continue their work, but the children were too anxious to get anything done. Violet tried to fix a hinge door on one of the traps, but all she could concentrate on was the knot of worry in her stomach. Klaus tried to read about the protecting oneself from thorny Peruvian plants, but thoughts of Stefano kept clouding his brain, and Sonny tried to bite rope, but she had a cold chill of fear running through her teeth, and she soon gave up. She didn't even feel like playing with this incredibly deadly viper. So the Beaudelaires spent the rest of the afternoon sitting silently in the reptile room, looking out the window for Uncle Monty's Jeep and listening to the occasional noise from upstairs. They didn't even want to think about what Stefano might be unpacking. Finally, as the snake-shaped hedges began to cast long, skinny shadows in the setting sun, the three children heard an approaching engine, and the Jeep pulled up. A large canoe was strapped to the roof of the Jeep, and the back seat was piled with Monty's purchases. Uncle Monty got out, struggling under the weight of several shopping bags, and saw the children through the glass walls of the reptile room. He smiled at them, and they smiled back, and in that instant, when they smiled, was created another moment of regret for them. Had they not paused to smile at Monty instead of gone dashing out to the car, they might have had a brief moment alone with him, but by the time they reached the entry hall, he was already talking to Stefano. "I didn't know what kind of toothbrush you preferred," Uncle Monty was saying apologetically, "so I got you one with extra firm bristles. Because that's the kind I like. Peruvian food tends to be sticky, so you need to have at least one extra toothbrush whenever you go there." "Extra firm bristles are fine with me," Stefano said, speaking to Uncle Monty, but looking at the orphans with his shiny, shiny eyes. "Shall I carry in the canoe?" "Yes, but my goodness, you can't carry it all by yourself. Klaus, please help Stefano, will you?" "Uncle Monty," Violet said, "we have something very important to tell you." "I'm all ears," Uncle Monty said, "but first let me show you the wasp repellent I picked up. I'm so glad Klaus read up on the insect situation in Peru, because the other repellents I have would have been no use at all." Uncle Monty rooted through one of the bags on his arm as the children waited impatiently for him to finish. "This one contains a chemical called—" "Uncle Monty," Klaus said, "what we have to tell you really can't wait." Okay, well, I'm at 24 minutes. I'm going to have to stop right here because that's too long. So we will find out what they get or do not get to tell Uncle Monty next week.